Well, hi, everyone. I'm Karli Viña, and this is episode 322 of At Percussion. With me today are my wonderful co-hosts, Caleb Pickering. Hey, Caleb.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Caleb, how does it feel to be the only person in the room who never studied with Matt Strauss?
I'll see y'all later, maybe on episode 323 or something. Hey, how's it feel for y'all three to be the only person that didn't? Well, I was going to say study with Casey, but sometimes that's more of a curse than a blessing.
And we're not editing that out.
Yeah, leave that in.
And Ben Charles is also here. Ben, how's it going?
Hey, Karli, doing well. How are you?
Good. So if you're listening on release date, that means that today is March 31st. So Ben, what happened in music history on March 31st?
Well, Karli, a few things happened. So in rock and roll history, in 1958, Chuck Berry's Johnny B. Good was released. That's, of course, the song that appears in Back to the Future. And in 1967, the Jimi Hendrix Experience began its first British tour. The show at the Astoria in London featured the first time that Hendrix ever set his guitar on fire, which was a thing that happened. So there's a little picture of that if you've never seen Jimi Hendrix with his guitar on fire. That instrument, actually in 2008, the burned instrument sold for more than $450,000 at auction. And then we have a couple of birthdays in music history. In 1732, Joseph Haydn was born, and he turns 290 today. And the big one that I wanted to talk about is in 1685, Bach was born. And so that means today is his 337th birthday. And I thought we could play a little game, and we haven't introduced our guest yet, but our guest today is Brady Spitz. And Brady, you're welcome to play in the game as well. So I have, let's see here, 7 facts. They are all true facts about composers, but only some of them are about Bach. So we're going to play a game I'm calling Bach or Knocked. So the first fact, and for all these I will say Bach in the question, but I'll tell you if it's false, I'll tell you who it actually was. So the first one is that Bach was an 8th generation musician. Bach or Knocked?
I'm going for Bach.
I think Bach.
That is indeed Bach. Very good. His father, Johann Ambrosius Bach, was a 7th generation musician and carried on the tradition by teaching Bach how to play violin. The second Bach or Knocked fact is that Bach married his cousin.
I'm going for Bach. You know what? I think I'm going to go for Bach.
Anyone else want?
I think Knocked. What do you think, Brady?
Probably Knocked.
It is Bach. He married his cousin, Maria Barbara Bach, and they had 7 children. 2 of his sons from that relationship, Wilhelm Friedemann and Carl Philipp Emanuel, became composers and musicians like their fathers. The third one, Bach or Knocked. Bach once cut off the pigtails of a fellow choir member as a practical joke.
I hope
I'm going Knocked.
I think Knocked. That's so random. Like how is that even documented? Out of all the things that happened in his life, I don't think so.
Like I said, these are all about an actual composer. That was not Bach. That was Knocked. That was his birthday buddy, Joseph Haydn, actually did that. So true fact. The next Bach or Knocked. Bach was given a diamond ring by the Crown Prince of Sweden.
I'm going Knocked on that one.
No.
Knocked.
That is Bach, actually. He was given a diamond ring in 1714 from the Crown Prince Frederick of Sweden, who was amazed at his playing. Next Bach or Knocked. I said Bach. He was given the nickname Little Mushroom due to his height.
Was he short?
Was he?
Was he a little mushroom?
I've only ever seen busts of him, so I imagine just a floating head. I'm gonna go Bach.
I think Bach.
Yeah, I think so as well.
That was Knocked. That was Schubert was given the nickname Little Mushroom.
I'm glad I don't have to think about Little Mushroom every time I play Bach. I rarely play Schubert.
We got two more here. The next one, Bach kept a frog figurine in his pocket at all times and would rub it before concerts for good luck.
No way, knocked. That sounds like a
someone
Schumann
else.
thing.
That is a knocked. That is Edvard Grieg did that apparently.
That sounds right.
And the last Bach or knocked. Bach was arrested and put in jail for requesting release from a job on short notice.
Bach.
I'm gonna go Bach. It seems early enough in time that
Would the church have arrested him?
I'm gonna
Or
say
rather have him-
knocked. He had like 3 jobs in his whole life, right?
That is Bach. He angered Duke Wilhelm for requesting release from his position on short notice and desiring to go work for Prince Leopold of, pardon my German, Cothen. He was arrested and put in jail for several weeks in 1716. I should have put a ringer in there about like Bach set his organ on fire, but I wasn't that smart. But yeah, so that's today's game of Bach or knocked. Thanks everyone for playing.
That 100% has to stay every week here on out. That has to be a regular segment because that was fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, I had to be careful because all the Bach facts at first were really normal and all the not ones were really bizarre. So I had to try and find weirder facts about Bach. So there you
I'm
go.
really glad that that's not how my doctoral comps went because I was really bad, really bad at it.
Schick or nicked. Yeah.
Next, yeah. Well, thanks, Ben. Now we have a new segment. I'm gonna have to live up to that next. What can I make into a game? Well, you've already heard his voice, but I'm very happy to introduce today's guest. Brady Spitz serves as the assistant professor and director of percussion at University of Tennessee, Martin. He has a wealth of experience both teaching and playing with classical, contemporary, marching percussion, and also world percussion. He's played with some major U.S. orchestras, including the Houston Symphony and the Hawaii Symphony. He's collaborated with artists like Claire Chase and Mario Davidovsky, and he has an organ and percussion duo called Sonic Boom. Brady has also done extensive work, including his 200-something page doctoral dissertation in the area of Lou Harrison's American Gamelan, and he also has a new book coming out soon, both of which they're both things that we'll be talking about today. So welcome to the show, Brady. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This is going to be a blast.
So we met many, many years ago. I don't know if you remember, but certainly we haven't talked since you started your new job. Congratulations. How's your school year been?
Thanks so much. Yeah, it's been great. Obviously it's sort of a whirlwind. I think anytime you get into a new job, let alone sort of a big kid teaching job. So we're about to come back off spring break now. It's kind of late in the year for spring break, but I've enjoyed the break, but now I'm ready to get to the final push. We got percussion ensemble in a couple weeks and some great students here, so I'm really excited.
Yeah, awesome. This is the point in the semester, I feel like, where we can both see the end and also think about here's all the things that happen between now and then. And I don't know how it's all going to happen, but it will.
It's close enough where you start salivating for the creative work you get to do over the summer.
Yeah. And practice time and,
Between this job and a toddler, practicing is kind of a myth the last 8 months or so for me. So,
well, it's a lot. I mean, our listeners might know Caleb and I are also in our first year at a new school, and I keep hoping like things calm down. Like once you get the ropes and you kind of everything's established. Ideally, it does get easier, but I don't know if that's
absolutely.
true.
Maybe, but I mean, it's a lot of work, but obviously we wouldn't be doing this if it weren't also a lot of fun. So I think love doing this work, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're really happy for you. I'm glad you're having a good time there. So
I do remember when we met in Miami though. I do remember that. Yeah. that was quite a while ago. That must have been 2014.
Something like that. I was there then for sure.
We were talking about that earlier. It was 2014 because I remember the apartment I was in because you visited.
Well, as I mentioned, Brady's done quite a bit of work on American Gamelan, and that's going to be our main focus of the episode today. Brady, would you give us a bit of background about what exactly American Gamelan is? What does that term refer to?
That's actually a great question, because there is a bit of a conundrum around the terminology. Um, a lot of college programs tend to have, or they have gamelan programs of some variety or another. So Javanese or Balinese gamelan, which are the two major varieties of gamelan that you'll see. American gamelan essentially was a way for American composers to recreate some of the sound palettes that they would hear in Javanese and Balinese music, but they didn't want to import, a $40,000 set of instruments from Indonesia. So they started using different elements of materials that were available in the United States. So we get on the West Coast, which is sort of one of the big focuses, we get the use of recycled aircraft aluminum and other aluminum elements, which are just sort of readily available because of the industry on the West Coast. And then on the East Coast, we get a lot of iron gamelans, which are made out of sort of the industrial Northeast, like leftover car parts and things from like the Rust Belt. And they essentially tuned them starting off in a similar way, and they created a sort of sound palette similar to a gamelan. And then some, they stuck with what I would consider sort of more traditional Indonesian compositional techniques, but they sort of quickly branched off into experimental and conceptual composition. Even in the heyday of American gamelan in the mid to late 70s, you would see 1970s. It is in the mid to late 1970s. You'll see like, things like very graphic notation, conceptual scores, process pieces, and so the instruments themselves, even though they're a gamelan, they really get outside the box. Now, the instruments that I specialize in, and this is where the I guess the misnomer or the controversy comes in, is because the instruments that I wrote my dissertation on are what people talk about when they say Lou Harrison's American Gamelan, or one of them. And it's a set of pipes that he tuned in just intonation in like 1970, 1971. And he wrote 3 pieces, including a really gorgeous oratorio and like a puppet opera. And he didn't really construct them as a gamelan. But he called them a gamelan just to kind of be cheeky with his partner, and it kind of stuck. And so now people think of in like the Grout Poliska textbook, you'll see like, oh, the picture of Lou Harrison with like the cut off oxygen tanks and like the scrap metal stuff. And he did all that stuff basically to compose stuff for his Chinese ensemble, which was sort of gigging in the Bay Area. And he never had a second thought about gamelan. And then 5 years later, then we start to have an actual American gamelan movement with him involved, with a different set of instruments that actually were trying to copy some of the Javanese concepts. So it's sort of like a interesting all over the map, but basically it's tuned metals that are sometimes inspired by Javanese things and sometimes not. It's a very complicated answer.
Brady, I had a question. I remember a few years ago being at PASIC and visiting the Rhythm Discovery Center, the little PAS museum, and they had some sort of Lou Harrison American Gamelan thing there. I don't remember if that was a temporary exhibit or permanent. Do you know if that's still there?
Yeah, it's not up on exhibition now. At least it wasn't when I was at PASIC this last year. But was the ones in? Do you remember if they were in the red cases, the red boxes?
I think I remember like tubes, like pipes.
Yeah. So the instruments that Lou built with his partner for this stuff in the very early 70s, before his gamelan stuff, it's a set of instruments called Old Granddad. And those would have been the pipes in the red boxes with the oxygen tanks. And PAS essentially found, bought, and refurbished the original set that Lou built. There are 3 other sets of those in existence, 3 copies of the original set, but PAS refurbished the original set and put it out as like a display piece. And then when they actually originally opened the exhibit, you could actually play the pipes.
Yeah, I think I remember that.
But I think they for the last PASIC. I think they put them back into storage, but that's the original old Granddad, which is the instrument that Lou traveled with. Like he took that set with him to Japan to do PMF a couple times. Yeah, so that's the old Granddad set that was his original sort of experiment.
Which, really quickly, side plug, if you're ever in Indianapolis, it's totally worth going to that museum. And I know they have like so much stuff they have to like rotate out exhibits, so not at all surprised that it's not out, but it's really cool getting to see all this stuff there. One of my favorite things was they have the handwritten manuscript for Musser's Etude in C.
Yeah, and they also have all the old like Musser experiment instruments, like the
Celestephone.
The Celestephone, yeah, exactly. Or Emil Richards, like the rock, the tuned like rock that you can like. You guys know what I'm talking about? Like it's like a lithophone that you can like slide another rock on, but all the little digits are cut different lengths, so it plays a pitch as you slide the rocks against each other.
Well, I did not know about that.
Yeah, it's super cool. Because they have some of Emil Richards stuff and then all the Musser stuff and then obviously all these old drum sets. It's an incredible collection. I wish they could keep all of it out all the time.
It's so cool. It's definitely worth a side trip at PASIC. I haven't gone in years, maybe since my first PASIC ever. I'm always thinking like, oh, I want to like these clinics are only happening here this year and I can go next year. But I'll have to probably, since my first time, I have much better context to understand what all these things are. So you mentioned old Granddad #1, and I saw on your website that I think you had gone to visit maybe old Granddad #4 at MIT. Where are the other two?
So #2 is it's in California. It's at University of California, Santa Cruz, and they use it there every so often. I don't know if it's owned by the university or if it's owned by Willie Wynant. But Willie Wynant was, do you guys know him at all?
No.
He's a guy you should know. Like Willie Wynant is, he collaborated with kind of everybody famous on the West Coast. He was close friends with Lou Harrison. He was close friends with Zhevsky. He used to tour with Oingo Boingo and Danny Elfman. So like he's got a wild resume, but I think he owns, or at least he's the caretaker for #2. #3 is owned by a guy named John Pennington. Yeah. And he is in Montana. It's kind of an interesting story. So Lou and his partner, Bill Colvig was his partner, and he was a kind of an engineer electrician. They built the first set, traveled with it until the first set was almost in disrepair. And then they commissioned a guy in Colorado. I guess he was living in somewhere else at that point, Taos maybe, to build a second set, to refurbish the first set and build a second set. And then they commissioned, when he had the instruments, the original #1, he made a copy for himself, and they kept it in Durango. Do you guys know Richard Cook? If you guys have ever been to a public park and you see these things where they have like aluminum slabs, or they have like pipes from like kids' playgrounds, and you can just tap them with like that's probably Free Notes, which is a Richard Cook company, and he's good at that. But he also rebuilt all of Lou's instruments, and so he made a second set and then a third set, and John Pennington has the third set, which is actually wild because I'm getting into the weeds a little bit, but the one of the things that makes Granddad so special is that it has these kind of like baritone and bass plates. So you get down to these super low frequencies, and on the old Granddad #4, which the Boston Modern Orchestra Project commissioned, the bass plates are on these resonators, which are essentially like concrete forming tubes that are like 14 inches or whatever in diameter, and they're like 6 feet tall. So those are the resonating chambers for these slabs. Well, in #3, they wanted to be able to like hike them into the mountains so they could do like sound installations. So #3, you actually see pictures of it from when it used to visit other places. There's some pictures when it was in residency at Vanderbilt like a bunch of years ago. And there's like these horizontal resonators that look like, a missile launcher. And it's because they took each note on its resonator individually and put it on their shoulder and used to like hike up a mountain with it. So that's number 3. It's in Montana. And then number 4 is owned by Jody Diamond, who was the woman that I went to go visit at MIT. And she was there with Evan Ziporin, who runs their Balinese gamelan and a bunch of other stuff. He's a great composer. And she has it, I think, in storage right now. They're sort of looking for a permanent home for it. But that's where number 4 is right now. So they're all over the place.
Brady, just thinking back on what I saw in those instruments and the fact that this week for Jason Truding's Extremes, I had to get a hacksaw and some metal conduit piping and make 3 more pipes. Yeah. These instruments, I mean, I wouldn't say they're crude, because there is tuning involved and all, but it's also, it seems like not like as difficult as, say, building a marimba. And I was wondering, have you like made yourself one, like even just like one little thing?
I did. It's actually how I got into doing this stuff.
Tell us about that.
Oh yeah. yeah, no, absolutely. So when I was in my master's degree, I was doing my master's with Brett Dietz at LSU, and he was super into solo glockenspiel at that point. And so I was doing like a catalog search on like solo glockenspiels, solo bells, whatever. And I came across a catalog listing at UC Santa Cruz for this solo for tenor bells. And I was like, what are tenor bells? I've never like heard this before. Well, it's essentially the alto instrument for old Granddad. So he wrote a solo for tenor bells as a tribute to Anthony Cerrone, because Tony Cerrone was the head of the percussion department when Lou was on composition faculty at Santa Cruz. So I got the manuscript for that, and I had to build a set of pipes. I had to like do all the research to figure out what the original instrument was. They wrote an article on kind of like how to do it, and I kind of had to figure it out. So what I did was I bought the original old Granddad has a set of aluminum pipes and a set of steel pipes for each pitch range, because he liked the timbral combination of both metals. And so I bought EMT, which is a little bit cruder. EMT is just the electrical like extruded conduit that you can buy at Lowe's or Home Depot. What I did was I cut it off sort of to length, maybe 1/4 of an inch too long for the pitch. And then you get a strobe tuner and an angle grinder out, and you just sort of go at it until you get it to the right frequency range. And then what
we were using hacksaws to do ours, and like I'm lucky to have all 10 fingers at this point.
I can imagine. That's
yeah, I mean, man. Once you get it close, like trying to shave off 1/8 of an inch with a hacksaw is not good.
Yeah, the cost of the instrument should include the ER bill, I think.
Yeah. Well, and also to stabilize the pipes, we had to like sit on them, so we're doing it like right next to it. It was a mess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was lucky enough to have an instrument repair shop with a belt sander and an angle grinder, so I could.
That would be amazing. Yeah.
I know that Richard does this thing when he builds his pipes, where to get I don't know if you have dealt with this, but when you hit a pipe, there are discrepancies in the thickness, like the wall thickness of the metal. And so the pipe can kind of have like a wobble to the pitch a little bit. And it's because it's vibrating, like a mode of vibration is a lateral and a vertical mode of vibration. And so Richard actually goes through and finds the higher mode of vibration, and then he tunes the lower mode of vibration up to the higher one by like kind of not like notching it, but like just barely kind of like rounding out some of the ends in a certain way to kind of make the pitch stand a little bit more still. So it can get a lot more complicated. I would say that most people don't do it because it's not important to that style of composition necessarily. Like I feel like percussionists use a lot of pipes for texture and not necessarily for like harmonic resolution. So, but with the old Granddad stuff, the entire set of instruments is in just intonation, and that's the entire justification for the instruments. So if the pitches don't stand still and if the pitch is not super clear, then you should just play it on a marimba, you know?
So I was reading in your dissertation also, you kind of outline here steps like how you could create your own instruments, right?
Yeah, I tried to go into like, here are the exact frequencies and hear the exact pipe lengths and thicknesses, and tried to go into as much of the like resonating structures as I could, just because I feel like the point of the dissertation was not to like just to have some sort of excellent document on a thing that already exists, but to give people resources to do it on their own. So it's like, if you want to like cut a set of pipes to the right length so that you have a set of D major just intonation pitch sets, I've done all the math for you. And then I obviously, well, not obviously for the people that are listening to this, but my website has recordings of all the instruments and all the pitches individually. So the composers can take those pitches and just sequence them if they want to sort of create, you know, if you're working in a notation program and you want to create your own like patch set, or you want to put it on like a MIDI controller so you can just mess around with an instrument that's in just intonation and kind of mess with it. And then what I did was I took all this information and I brought it to a couple of composer friends, and had them write me pieces as like a test case. So there should be enough information to sort of build the instruments, and then also enough information to write for it, hopefully.
Yeah. Brady, I know our buddy here, frequent podcast guest host, Nozni, he builds the threads pipes and things like that. And I know I've seen Tracy Furr makes pipes and various wooden instruments. Is there anybody out there that's making gamelans, even as like a side project for themselves and selling them?
No. Well, so American gamelan stuff, not the Lou Harrison instruments specifically. There are other people that have made other stuff. So one of Lou Harrison's close collaborators is a guy named Daniel Schmidt. And Dan Schmidt is like, he's turning 80 really soon. And Dan Schmidt was sort of famous for making basically West Coast American gamelans that you could commission. Now he's kind of passing on the knowledge a bit. But yeah, so there are people that make some, but not, I think, on the scale of, you know, anybody in the percussion community that's making pipes, unfortunately. Dan's instruments are really interesting. He makes like wood frames, like really nice tung oil polished wood frames that kind of look like Orff instruments. And then he has usually aluminum and brass like slabs. And then he actually pounds out these, they kind of look like nipple gongs, but they have no skirt on them. So it just is like a plate with a nipple on it, like a raised center. And they're meant to emulate the bonang or any of the sort of like smaller nipple gongs that you might see in a Javanese or a Balinese orchestra. So he's the only one that I know that's really making them and sort of made a small business interest out of it. But yeah, I mean, I've toyed with the idea, but it's definitely like a passion project that would take a couple of years to get right.
Yeah. And kind of a follow-up, I know not a lot of people, but steel drums in America have become more popular and there's more people making them. And the work is obviously, there's a lot of work that goes into it, but the materials themselves are fairly cheap. And to make, of course, the thread pipes are fairly cheap. But I feel like American gamelan would be a little bit more of a maybe cost prohibitive endeavor to build that kind of instrument. Is it?
Well, I don't know. I would think that, like, I own a small set of Dan Schmidt instruments. There are 6 what are called saron, which are like keyboard instruments, like single octave keyboards, you know. And then I own a slentum and some, instead of having all the big gongs that you'll see like in a Javanese or a Balinese gamelan, I have a set of like bass keys, kind of like the old Granddad instruments. So they're like a big dedicated like resonator that's adjustable, and then you can put on like, you know, a piece of plate aluminum that's like a 1/4 inch thick, and it's like, I don't know, 7 inches wide by about 12 to 15 inches long, and it gets you like, you know, a C below the range of a marimba. So all that aluminum and all the support structure probably wouldn't cost you as much as, you know, a pair of double seconds. for a steel band program. They're probably cheaper than a set of 6 basses. So you could probably do it. I think the thing that's prohibitive is that Indonesian music is more intimidating, and people don't understand the culture around contemporary composition in Indonesia in the way that they sort of intuitively get steel band, because it's more similar to what we're familiar with pop and jazz.
Sure.
I think a lot of people aren't aware that like there are contemporary Indonesian composers writing experimental music for gamelan, or writing things that are within the compositional lineage of Balinese or Javanese tradition. I think people just don't connect with it in the same way. It just seems like super, super complicated. So it's not like maybe worthwhile right off the bat. I think it's totally worthwhile, but I'm gonna have to work on selling that.
Having experienced what you're describing, University of Illinois has a wonderful gamelan taught by Pakas Nawa, and I think one of the biggest things is the obstacle of notation, because they don't notate using Western notation, and the instruments aren't chromatic, so I don't think they're as quote unquote well set up for that. And so that was always a huge obstacle for us, was the notation. And there was a guy, Cody Jensen, that was very good at taking Bach's instructions and converting them into some sort of written notation that we could use, whether that was actual music or some sort of outline.
Yeah, that's right. The cipher notation is difficult, but what's really curious is that there are sort of two populations that love gamelan. There is the sort of composer performer sort of cohort that just love it and they dig into cipher notation. They want to play all the gamelan stuff. And then there are complete amateurs who don't know anything about music. And in fact, they used gamelan as a rehabilitative tool in prisons in England. Like, it's not, there are people that are completely unfamiliar with this instrument. And if you don't have to rely on the notation, they don't have the barriers to it, I think, that we do. I mean, certainly I'm still breaking down those barriers because I've had Western music drilled into me for 30 years, It
reminds me, I had a teacher, Ricardo Flores, that was great at steel pan, and I've never been good at steel pan. And I asked, like, how do you, like, the notes, where they are, it's confusing. And he was like, well, you grew up playing like piano and marimba. He's like, I couldn't do that stuff when I went to college, so none of it made sense. So this was easy for me.
I think the Indonesians have the same thing with their concept of time, because everything doesn't flow from beat one, it flows to the gong at the end of the phrase. And so you have to build all the musical notation back from the end of the sentence. So it seems really intimidating at first.
Wow, that kind of just blew my mind in that moment, thinking about like
it's weird. So it's like
time.
So it's like 4 3 2 1, and then instead of being 4 and 3 and 2 and 1, it would be and 4 and 3 and 2 and 1, and then it would be and E4 and E3 and E2 and E1. So everything, all the different layers of colotomy, the layers of rhythmic subdivision, back up from the beat forward and then flow to the end of the phrase.
Wow.
One of my other favorite things about gamelan music was the sense of rubato or fermatas. There's a lot of gamelan music has with this like ching, ching, and it's like in Western music, like we're always like, who do I look for a cue? And like the whole group just breathes and does it like it's nothing. It was like a great lesson in chamber music, I thought.
I think so too. I think I don't think that we as percussionists actually have a problem looking down our nose at world music, but I think maybe some other instrument groups do. And I always thought that the best kind of training in chamber music was always like, you could do gamelan or you could do like West African stuff. You can do steel band, especially steel band combo stuff, since the instruments kind of speak later than you hit the note. There's always just a lot of chamber music lessons that are found in these types of music, and I always found that they were a great asset to me when I was a student.
Yeah, Brady, that reminds me, there's a great quote from Debussy on when he first heard gamelan, and he said, Javanese music obeys laws of counterpoint that make Palestrina seem like child's play, and if one listens to it without being prejudiced by one's European ears, one will find a percussive charm that forces one to admit that our own music is not much more than a barbarous kind of noise fit for a traveling circus.
That's funny. You know, there's a good Lou Harrison quote too. Or not a quote, but he used to, with all of his students, he never referred to the continent of Europe. He just called it Northwest Asia because he thought it was. He's like, why do we have this different music? It's not a different landmass. It's just Northwest Asia. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, Brady, you started a gamelan ensemble at your former position at Houston Baptist University, and I saw that the ensemble performed at PASIC in 2019, which is awesome. Congratulations. I'm wondering what did it take to make that happen? Like forming an ensemble, like I assume probably instruments had to be purchased, and that's probably a really large a large hurdle. And you kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'm wondering too, what you think about what skills do percussion and music students in general get from playing in a gamelan ensemble that they might not get from, you know, percussion ensemble or more traditional Western chamber music?
So when I was at HBU, I sort of inherited this set of Dan Schmidt instruments. So we didn't have to purchase anything. That was really nice. And in fact, the piece that we played on Focus Day at PASIC was actually not even for a full set of instruments. We had one set of bonang, and then we had, I think, like 7 or 8 players sit around the bonang. And they played essentially a piece of process music where they just hocketed the entire time. So you like have one player establish time, and then you add in, and they sort of layer in this like recursive sort of algorithm until you build the piece out. So that's kind of the instrument and the piece of music. The piece was called Kenong for Bonang by Jody Diamond, who was actually one of Harrison's gamelan teachers. When we did it, the reason I wanted to do gamelan with the students at HBU is, like a lot of programs, it was a very small music department. So the band was not more than a couple dozen people at the time. There were 2 percussion majors. And I was sort of preparing during COVID to do like a trio with them and sort of have some, you know, some chamber music experience, but there were not enough brass players to do a brass quintet. There were not enough woodwind players to do like a woodwind quartet. And it was like, we need to be able to give these students chamber music experiences that are sort of outside of what they're capable of doing, because we can't do brass quintets, you know? So this was our way of doing some chamber music stuff with all of the majors that wanted to be involved in chamber music, because they didn't have any other avenues in that small of a school. And I think it worked out really well. It worked out really well for them. They had a good time, obviously, on the trip. It was one of the only chamber music experiences they would have in a 4-year degree at a small school. And I think gamelan, you know, we talk about sort of chamber music skills. I think that's really important. What percussionists specifically can get out of it, depending on the type of gamelan that you actually play, whether you're doing American gamelan things where you can do really conceptual or experimental composition, or whether you want to, you know, be at a place where you're doing sort of more traditional Javanese gamelan or more traditional Balinese gamelan. Balinese gamelan tends to be really kind of athletic. So there are some sort of slower, more meditative aspects to it, but the whole idea of this like crazy hocketing that happens in gamelan is all in Balinese stuff. So for you like marching bass drummers, drum 1 and drum 2 freaks out there, like Balinese gamelan is where you want to be. And then with the Javanese gamelan, it can be slower and more meditative, but it's also quasi improvisatory. So the reason that Debussy had that quote about counterpoint is because there's essentially a core melody called a balungan in Javanese music, and no one plays the balungan in a sort of more professional group. Everyone plays around the balungan, and they kind of play rules and guidelines that, you know, like if the melody goes like, I'm using numbers because that's what the Javanese would use, or if you're in cipher notation, it goes like 3 5 6 1. You might have a player that goes like 3 5 3 5 5 6 5 6 6 1 6 1 1 6 1 6, or whatever, right? They're sort of playing in this counterpoint that dances around the Belungen melody, and then you have 20 people all following a different set of rules, and so the Belungen is felt, but it's never played by one person. And so you sort of have to develop your own sense of independence and counterpoint, and you are free to improvise within these guidelines, which are not dissimilar to improvising in jazz or having sort of an improvisatory percussion ensemble piece where you need to have some aleatoric moments. You're just sort of following more structured harmonic rules.
Yeah, that's so cool and so thoughtful. It sounds like it wasn't a very tough sell at HBU.
Oh no, not I think the students really enjoyed it. We had a great time at PASIC. I think the administrators really enjoyed being able to offer both the educational experience for the students and also the high profile experience for both the students and the department. I think it was a win-win-win-win-win-win-win.
Sounds like it. It sounds awesome. You know, at University of Maryland, when I was a student there was a full gamelan ensemble, but it was mostly like I don't even remember music majors being a part of it. They just rehearsed in our band rehearsal room and had all the instruments stored. And it's like at the time it was kind of like, oh, I don't have time for that. I'm busy doing excerpts and marimba solos and all the normal stuff. And now it's like, wow, like that is not a normal thing at a lot of schools. The gamelan, there was a koto ensemble there too. Like it's just cool. If you have the opportunity, those who might be listening, soak it up.
Well, Ben and I were so fortunate to go to North Texas, and we had so many different experiences. So like we could do all the marimba stuff and all the excerpts and drum set and whatever. But then if you didn't go through that experience and do like the gamelan with Ed Smith, or you didn't do the West African stuff, or you didn't study with Jose Aponte or whatever, it's just like you're missing out. And I'm really thankful that I did. Like, I think there are so many, they're hard skills, but they're also soft skills that you learn when you're dealing with like in Ed Smith's ensemble, he would kind of give out cipher notation. You have to rote learn some things. And it's just like, there are a lot of soft skills in learning to prepare for that type of ensemble that like, have very little to do with like how good your chamber music playing is. So,
or like learning how to rehearse once a week instead of 3 times a week, and like remember stuff Monday to Monday. But yeah, Ed Smith is just one of the most kind, wonderful, amazing people and musicians I've ever met. So thank you, Ed, for everything.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. If you're listening, you're the man.
Nice. Well, I want to talk a little bit about your dissertation too before we get on to your book. But Brady, your dissertation is a composer's guide to writing for old Granddad, which is Lou Harrison's set of gamelan instruments. So I'm wondering, what are some of the biggest takeaways that you think a composer should have in mind when they're writing for this instrument or the set of instruments?
I think the history of it and how it relates to just intonation is really important for composers that want to dip their toes in the JI pool. Percussionists, we don't tend to think about this that much because we don't have to. Our instruments come in tune already unless they're timpani. I guess the greatest timpanists, they do think about just intonation. Dave Herbert gives a class all about this, but with just intonation, we're sort of forced to think about the ramifications tonally of what you're doing. So for instance, a piece that's not in the dissertation, but is that solo to Anthony Cerrone that I was talking about earlier, it's a set of tenor bells is in just intonation D major, and then everything is tuned via super particular ratios. So obviously we all know, I mean, am I good to give like a little JI primer here?
Yeah.
Okay. So like octaves are tuned, the frequencies are tuned exactly 2-1. So like A440, an octave above it is A880. Originally it was that every set of notes was tuned in a ratio also. So a fifth is a ratio of 3-2. So an E above an A440 is E660. And then the D is also a ratio. So it's 4-3. And then we have thirds in different ratios. And That's just intonation, where everything is related via ratios. But that means that instruments can only be in one key. So before, this is why Bach wrote well-tempered clavier. Temper is describing the tuning, obviously, right? Happy birthday, Bach. So there were all kinds of experiments throughout sort of the late Middle Ages. They're taking sort of this, like, they sort of inherited Boethius and tried to start like departing from the Greeks to make things easier to use. And so we get into various temperaments to allow people to switch keys, and some more successfully than others, until we get to equal temperament, where the octaves are basically equal, and then you just divide all the half steps into 12 equal parts. And so that means that things like major and minor thirds are significantly different in just intonation than they are in equal temperament. If you ever have an opportunity to play a major chord on a just intonation instrument versus a major chord on an equal temperament instrument, you can actually hear beats in the chord when you play an equal temperament instrument, and then the notes just stand still when you play on a just intonation instrument. So it's more pure, I guess. You get too far down the rabbit hole and it can kind of be an adjustment for your ears, like if you listen to a lot of Harry Partch or Ben Jonson or something. So this piece, to get back to this piece with the solo to Anthony Cerrone, you have to build the instrument. It has to be all the ratios relate to D. And then during the middle of the piece, he essentially modulates to A, the dominant of the key of the piece. That is really wild. That it's really wild to go to a dominant of a tonic when you're in just intonation. It creates a lot of conflict harmonically, because the pillar tones for the dominant key area are way like outside of what you would sort of expect in equal temperament. And so all this conflict essentially is the entire justification for the piece. And in fact, at the bottom of it, Harrison even says, like, this piece has to be in just intonation, otherwise the narrow escape back to D major, and thus the entire point of the piece are lost. So that's kind of what I think about the old Granddad instruments. Is it's the way that Lou Harrison started dipping his toe into the just intonation pool, and it's the way that he sort of made music with a lot of intellectual rigor, but not a lot of materials. I think in the same way that, like, he and Partch were friends. Partch would have like a 47 note octave or whatever. Harrison always wanted much simpler intervals, but he always wanted the same sort of intellectual rigor where the piece was completely designed around the intonation structure. And so I think if you want to sort of dip into that world, you can look at the complexity of Harry Partch and then the simplicity of Lou Harrison, and they kind of have the same vibe.
It's all so interesting.
I know, it's cool, and then you have to take a break and go for a walk.
Right. It's a whole, like you said, it's a whole rabbit hole to go down and just think about, all the implications. And my mind is still stuck on feeling time from the end of the bar. I'm going to be thinking about that all week. So your research also included, well, I guess your whole dissertation project included the commissioning of a new work for Old Granddad. It's called Laurel by Shane Monds. Tell us a little bit about the work. Has it been premiered yet?
It hasn't. The thing was written before COVID, maybe only a year before COVID, and there needs to be a commissioning project. Renting a set of Old Granddad instruments and putting them in a hall would take just the set of instruments is like a $5,000 rental fee. So we have to sort of get into like commissioning the project to happen. But Shane's work, I thought it was sort of phenomenal. He sort of took essentially tonal instruments, and he designed the piece around the Old Granddad instruments, where the materials played on instruments that are not part of Old Granddad shift the tonality of Old Granddad. So you can take like 5-note subsets of the Old Granddad set, or like 3-note subsets, and reorient them to things that exist within equal temperament. And that makes Old Granddad suddenly be in the key of B minor, or suddenly be in the key of like A major. and it works with the just intonation scheme. He did all the like interval math. So Laurel is he's a big like North Indian buff. So he wanted to go through this Indian compositional technique called a Laurel, and essentially was his way of cycling the old Granddad instrument through all 12 keys in the same way that a sitar player might transition through a Laurel of ragas in one evening. So it's about an hour 15-minute long piece of music that essentially forces this instrument, which cannot be moved from D major, and forces it to be in all 12 keys.
It's super interesting. Well, I hope we all get to hear it someday.
Yeah, I know. COVID kind of threw a wrench in everything, but definitely applying for grants to get it done. So hopefully sometime in the near future.
Yeah, it sounds super cool. I was looking at the composition date and I was thinking like, and then I was like, oh, is there a recording somewhere? And I didn't find anything. I was like, oh, that's probably why. This is pretty complicated. And even, I mean, yeah, shipping the instruments and.
Yeah, well, so it is. The last set of instruments was commissioned by Boston Modern Orchestra Project because they didn't want to pay for the rental and the transportation of a set of instruments from California. And so they built a set of instruments to make a recording of 2 of the 3 pieces that Lou wrote for Old Granddad. So he originally wrote a puppet opera called Young Caesar. And then he wrote an oratorio called La Coro Sutro. And then he wrote a suite for violin and American Gamelan. And people usually record the later 2. A lot of choir directors, La Coro Sutro is kind of like a bucket list item for a lot of choir directors. And they're gorgeous. This is kind of why I love this set of instruments, because it's like so unique and so amazing. Like La Coro Sutro is a chorus, plus the American Gamelan instruments, plus like tam-tam and concert bass drum, plus an organ. It's really like wild. People play it with all different kinds of organs. It's crazy.
Well, Brady, before we move on and do talk about your book, would you tell us a little bit about Lou Harrison's different types of gamelan? Yeah.
So I think a lot of people, when they think of Lou Harrison, they sort of, at least for percussionists, we tend to think of his like 1930s and 40s classic percussion ensemble era stuff. And they kind of think of him as a gamelan composer or someone who sort of nebulously incorporates world music into his compositions. But he really wasn't an informed gamelan composer until the mid to late 70s. And in fact, all these old Granddad instruments were built before he really even knew anything about gamelan. He sort of had gamelan records and sort of knew what it sounded like, but knew nothing about it. So he had moved back to the Bay Area and was just sort of composing large ensemble works and doing chamber music and things. He really liked playing with his Chinese ensemble. So he and his partner and some other I guess instrumentalists and vocalists in the Bay Area, they sort of constituted a revolving roster and they would play like Chinese and Korean music or Lou's compositions loosely based around some of those ideas. And they were playing at I guess old spaghetti factory, some venue in San Francisco, and they were trying to use jaltaron, which are like, have you guys ever played varied trio? You know, the rice bowls, the Lou Harrison varied trio. There's this Indian instrument called a jaltaron, which is essentially like ceramic rice bowls. And he wanted them to be in just intonation. And so the way you put rice bowls into just intonation is by putting a little bit of water in it until it changes the pitch of the bowl. Well, he was like, he tells the story, he would go put the bowls, put them in tune, and then they would go eat and then come back to play the gig. And the bowls would just like sort of thunk and they had no resonance because the ceramic was soaking up the water. And so it was making the bowl go dead. And he was like, they started putting glycerin in the water and like coating the bowls and stuff. And he's like, there's got to be a better way. So they started using metal to sort of emulate this Korean instrument called a bangyang. And it's kind of like, it ended up kind of being like a vibraphone. So they wanted just intonation instruments to play Chinese and Korean music, and they ended up calling it a gamelan because they didn't know any better, which is kind of a funny roundabout way to get to things. So he composed the 3 pieces for it, and then they start doing this world music seminar at Berkeley in 1974, 1975. And they had in Pak Chokro, who was sort of a world-renowned gamelan composer at that point, sort of like Javanese gamelan royalty. And Lou immediately stopped like the other stuff that he was doing, and he was just like, just teach me everything about Javanese gamelan. That's when he started learning about Javanese gamelan. And so then he and Bill built a full set of Javanese instruments called C. Betty is the name of the instruments that he built. And they ended up building a couple that are basically Americanized versions of full Javanese court gamelan. And that's kind of where he started doing all of his gamelan stuff. So the double concerto for violin and cello with gamelan is for C. Betty, and the was it the In Memoriam Carlos Chavez, all this sort of like gamelan degung stuff with Western instruments is all for C. Betty. Yeah, and that's how he kind of got into it. And that's how he met Dan Schmidt, and all of Dan's instruments are now based on Lou's old instruments from that period. So it's kind of a cool evolution, and they sort of just fell into Javanese music by way of Berkeley, I guess.
It's so interesting. What a visionary. I think about like the same with the Harry Partch instruments, like, you know, just to have this idea of, I want this instrument to exist. I'm going to find out how to build it, make it, and then write for it. And it's maybe not the most practical thing in the world. Like you said, it's really costly and difficult to play on the old Granddad instruments, for example. But, you know, I guess you have to hand it to them. Like they knew this is what it's got to be.
Yeah. I think Lou's thing, like, you have to he just always wanted to play with all of his toys. There's this analogy that he uses. He's like, I just have my yard and I put out all of my toys. So like he was a master of Piri flute, and he was he was invested in Chinese opera, and he knew about like medieval stuff. Like a lot of his multi-movement works involve like ricercares and like they use like iso rhythms and stuff. And so he was just like, I just want to have the things that I like, and I'm just going to keep playing with them no matter the cost, because it's what's fun for me. It's a little bit of a hedonist, I think.
Well, thanks so much for all of this super great information, and for breaking it down to a point where hopefully our listeners who maybe don't know much at all or anything about this can have something to grab onto, but it's still super compelling, interesting information.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk about it. If I can plug any of Lou's stuff, I would say go check out the any of the recordings of Le Coro Sutro or the Suite for Violin and American Gamelan. I think you'll sort of get the appeal right away.
Yeah, cool. We'll put your website in the show notes too, so people can listen to those sound clips that you have and just read more about it. And if you really love reading about it, they can read your dissertation too.
Oh yeah, it's posted right on the website.
It is this right
if you're looking.
And if they really like the dissertation, they can come study with you at UT Martin.
Yeah, that's right. That's absolutely right. If they're looking for some light bedtime reading, they can check out the dissertation. It's only 246 pages, I think.
Well, Brady, thank you so much for sharing all this with us. As we've mentioned, you have this new book coming up. Would you tell us a little bit what's it called? What's it about? How can people check it out?
Yeah, I'll have a book being released shortly called Brain Drain, which actually Caleb was kind enough to contribute to. The book is essentially kind of an beginning to intermediate Mallet method. And the justification for it came around because as I was teaching before I got this job in Tennessee, I was teaching, a lot of high school students, a lot of middle school students, doing some private lessons during my doctorate. And I noticed like a lot of them, they have these packets of warm-ups that they have to learn, right? Like, especially these people who do like really like Texas drumline, indoor drumline, they just like have to memorize tons and tons of exercises. And when I was actually working in the activity, we just wanted to keep it simple, and I started noticing all of these tertiary benefits. So the book is basically a way for you to mentally manipulate the materials that you're already aware of through music theory and use those to become a better mallet player. So instead of doing the entire George Hamilton Green, 50 studies book, just do lesson 1 in all 48 major and minor keys. Which I think a lot of us have already done. We have done it sort of as a dexterity exercise, or we've sort of done it as a way to keep warm-ups fresh or make sure we understand keys. But if you do it in a methodical way and you build an approach to reading around music theory, I think it actually helps solve kind of a lot of problems. So the analogy that I like in the book is, that I give in the introduction, is when you learn a language, you learn sort of the alphabet, the letters of the alphabet, and then you start stringing together rudimentary words like cat and dog and hat and things like that. And then eventually you get more complicated words, and then you can build sentences and paragraphs and pages. Well, we sort of learn to read notes on the page, and then we immediately jump into like an etude without like learning like, hey, this etude is not that hard. This is like an F major run up followed by like a G7, like a G dominant chord, like arpeggio coming back down, and then it steps up in this thirds thing that you kind of already know how to play. And so it's essentially focused around like using music theory to read patterns and sort of train mallet players to sort of mentally manipulate materials and then learn to read those manipulations on the page, as opposed to just providing 40 pages of notes to learn, which does teach students to read better, but it's sort of through brute force instead of a methodical approach to learning, I think.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. I remember when I was younger and hadn't studied music theory as much, sometimes when I was learning notes, it just felt like every next note was a random note, and I'm going to learn it, I'm going to memorize it, I can read that. But then as I learned more and more about music theory, like, of course you recognize patterns, but we don't usually get that in depth at a younger age. We think like, oh, college students are ready for this, or maybe high schoolers who are in AP music theory when they're already playing things well beyond, what like in as far as theory goes, well beyond what they know about.
Yeah, I think even less advanced players are capable of more than we might think that they're capable of being aware of. I remember when I was helping out with this 6th grade beginner percussion class. If you're in Texas, you're fortunate enough to have like a beginner, like dedicated instrument class, and the director needed some help, and he was like, well, I'm trying to like, can I just have you out for like a week to like help start them on keyboards? And I came out, and it's like the first lesson is just basically, stone stick control page 5 on C and F, and then you sort of learn some like tetrachordal melodies. You're sort of going at it, and I was like, let's just try something. So we learned sort of the half step diagram on the page, on the keyboard, excuse me. And then we just basically did like 8 on a hand, just up the chromatic scale, and then 4 on a hand, then 2 on a hand, then 1 on a hand, just sort of up and down the chromatic scale. So they learn to feel what half steps are like. And then I was like, okay, 2 half steps is a whole step. So let's play all of our whole tone scales. And we constructed both whole tone scales. And then we're like, okay, let's everybody play octatonic scales. And so we did all 3 octatonic collections. And so I had like 12-year-olds playing all 3 octatonic collections within a week, and then they went to learn their major scales, and I think they learned their major scales in like 3 weeks. Like it was amazing if you don't shortchange them and give them the concept.
Yeah, it's so interesting that I think you're right. We underestimate what they're capable of. I've been known to, like, I pull out the circle of fifths with 5th graders or 6th graders, and that wasn't something I saw until high school music theory. But otherwise, if you're learning your scales, it feels like random notes.
Yeah, it does. And I think that ends up being a barrier for promising students, because they feel like the speed at which they can sort of visually acquire the notes is their talent level. And it's not really right. Like, they're very talented musicians who they don't connect A to B to C very quick, but they can definitely play F major already if you let them.
Yeah. Well, and with all these exercises, they're getting a sense of the keyboard. I mean, I can't imagine these beginners that you have playing octatonic scales and all of this. And that, of course, helps their reading and helps everything else. They're just comfortable because they've done these things away from reading.
Yeah, it's like a 3-step process, right? You have to like recognize the note on the page, then you have to recognize where that note is on the keyboard, then you have to hit that note. So a lot of times they can work on steps 2 and 3 without ever having to look at the page by like saying the note name and like all these exercises. If you make them mentally challenging but not eyes connected to the page, they end up building a really detailed kinesthetic memory of the instrument that helps free up RAM, I guess, if you will. It helps free up sort of mental space to actually read and work on step number 1.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, Brady, I wrote just a short solo for this book for the end of it, along with some others. And we were just talking about it, so I pulled up this must be like Gen 1 or 2 PDF version you sent me of it. Yeah, I see some edit notes every now and then, and it's funny. But yeah, it's a really great book. I'm not sure when it's coming out, but it's pretty fantastic. I feel like if I had to classify it, I feel like it's kind of like the Peters Fundamental Method book or any of those texts with all the stuff you kind of don't need in the beginning. Like you kind of skip over, okay, here's where C is on the keyboard. Like that's there, but it doesn't go, as the book says, it starts for like the intermediate percussionist, not, you cut out all the first chapter is like scales and pattern recognition and whatnot. And I think it's really great. I mean, even like weaker college students, I feel like could really benefit from, reading the patterns and reading pattern recognition versus, just freaking out when they have to sight read and whatnot. It's great. I really like it.
No, I appreciate your kind words, and I appreciate you writing a piece for the back of it. Yeah, the back of the book. Caleb is one of a few composers. We also have Brian Nosny wrote another etude for the back, and Joe Moore wrote one. One of my composer friends, Ben Morris from Rice, also wrote one. And they sort of take advantage of the skills that you get in it. Yeah, I think when I was writing it, I was kind of like, when you do the Peters Fundamental book, or you do like the Macmillan technique book, or they or even the Goldenberg book or whatever, they have like, here are some exercises in this key, like here's scalar studies, and then here's like 12 measure etudes in scalar or whatever. But it doesn't talk about like the connective tissue among all those things. You're just sort of expected to go through 3 pages of the Goldenberg book, and then like you're like, oh, this etude is connected to that exercise. It was never sort of explicitly spelled out, and so you're sort of expected to make that leap yourself. And I think this book was an attempt to sort of like make that connection and strengthen that connection.
That's so great. So the important thing is, how can people check it out once it's released?
Yeah, it should be out in the next week or two. Actually, by the time this gets released, I'll have a landing page on the website. And actually, when you guys release this, I can sort of give you a URL that you can put in the show notes. You can go to bradyspitz.com and go to the store. I'm going to try and create maybe a coupon code for your listeners so they can come check it out with a little bit of a discount if they'd like. I should at least have the purchase link up by the time this episode is released, if not the entire item available for sale. So
awesome. Nice. Well, thank you.
No, thanks for letting me talk about it. I am passionate about my gamelan projects and all that stuff, but I also really enjoy teaching, and this type of material is the stuff that I've had the most success with getting the students to like just have that light bulb go off. And I think that's why I really love talking about that stuff as well.
Well, it's so important. There's lots of good resources, but I think as far as pedagogy in a lot of areas, like we need more resources that maybe approach the topic in a little bit different way. So
yeah, what's the Silicon Valley thing? We're gonna what is this? What did they say about reinventing stuff? Just creative destruction and I can't remember the phrase. But there's yeah, that's what I'm doing. I'm Silicon Valleying the whole percussion
Move
industry.
fast and break things.
Yeah, right. This is Mark Zuckerberg's finest quote.
That's how I practice.
Yeah, that doesn't really work for us, does it?
The timing on that, Caleb, was perfect.
Well, I had one quick little thing to say before we wrap. I just wanted to give Brady a shout out because, like Brady said, we both did our undergrads at UNT, and Brady was, I think, 2 years older than me. But Brady was the second person I met at UNT. We went to New York Sub Hub with Nate Sankery, and like it was like it's always just so cool to like see people that you went to school with do well. And Brady was always just like has been such a nice guy throughout the years, and it's just so good to get to see your face again, Brady.
Oh, thanks so much, Ben. Yeah, it's been quite a while since New York Sub Hub. I would love to go back.
I'm going to be going there in basically a week from today. So excited.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, right after this is released, I think we'll both be back in Denton for the same.
Oh, nice. Yeah, see you there. Yeah, that'll be too late for our listeners, but obviously, but no, it won't actually. Christopher Dean's memorial concert is Saturday. Is it April 2nd? Yeah, and I'm sure it'll be webcast. So if you are listening to this and want to check that out, I would encourage you to find the webcast linked on the UNT website.
Hey, yeah, Ben, you're playing Vespertine formations.
Yeah, so I'm playing Vespertine formations with Sandy Rinnick, Brian Zader, and Jason Baker. And there's all sorts of Christopher Dean related people playing. Josh Smith is performing Morning Dove Sonnet. Ijin Feng is performing, I think, Bones of Trang Zhu. On timpani, Mark Ford is performing Etude for a Quiet Hall. There's a few others, so definitely check that out.
Yeah, it's gonna be really nice.
That's so nice. Well, and enjoy. Brady, thank you so much for joining us and sharing so much of your knowledge and research with us. It's great to catch up with you again, and we'll see you all on episode 323.
All right, thanks so much for having me, everybody.
Thank you.